Hello, hello. Originally, this video was going to be about different types of fats and which ones are good for what uses and which ones to stay away from. But once I started making my notes, it kind of turned into mostly just being about saturated fat and cholesterol. So that's kind of what I'm going to dive into in this video, and then I'll get more into detail on other types of fats in another video, although I'll mention them briefly here. So a little breakdown of the different types of fats. There's 4 different types. So there's saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and trans fats. And now all fat molecules are made from a glycerol molecule and then 3 fatty acids. And those can either be saturated, mono, or polyunsaturated. So saturated fats have no double bonds in their chemical structure. So their carbon atoms are fully saturated with hydrogen. Monounsaturated fats have 1 double bond in their structure, and polyunsaturated fats have 2 or more double bonds in their chemical structure. Whew, that was a lot of chemistry for me. Let's move on from there. Okay, so all fats are some combination of those. There's nothing that's 100% saturated or 100% mono or polyunsaturated. Fats that are mostly saturated are going to be solid at room temperature, and then fats that are mostly mono or polyunsaturated will be liquid at room temperature. So when thinking about which fats are good or bad, probably have heard that trans fats are bad, which is true. However, there's actually some naturally occurring trans fats, but we're not going to talk about that. And then you probably are under the assumption that saturated fat is bad, at least if you have too much of it. So it's not that simple, though. The idea that saturated fats are bad for us comes from the diet heart hypothesis from the late 1950s. And this was an effort to figure out why there was such an increase in heart disease and heart attacks. And so researchers found that people consuming the most saturated fat had higher levels of cholesterol. And cholesterol was also found in the arteries of people who were having these heart attacks. So if saturated fat was increasing cholesterol and cholesterol was found in the heart attack victims, then saturated fat is bad, right? Well, not really. This was based on observational data, which really can't be used for much, animal studies, and assumptions. It was never shown to be true in humans, and to this day it still hasn't been shown to be true that saturated fat causes heart disease. Saturated fats can indeed raise cholesterol, but that rise in cholesterol does not actually result in higher mortality rates. And this has been found to be true many times in studies. In fact, the opposite has been shown to be true, that people with higher cholesterol tend to live longer. But unfortunately, the diet heart hypothesis became public policy before it was ever proven to be true, and still hasn't been proven to be true. But so we all grew up, or probably if you're listening to this, you grew up thinking that saturated fat was bad for you, and you probably still are limiting how much you have because this idea is so pervasive. So we can't really talk about saturated fat without going down the rabbit hole a little bit of cholesterol. So let's take a little peek at that. And I should mention that, I meant to say this at the beginning, I am not a doctor. This is not to be used as medical advice. I'm not advising you to stop any medication if you are on anything, if you're seeing a doctor for cholesterol or heart issues or anything like that. I'm just giving some additional information that I hope you will take and look further into on your own, and even talk to your doctor about this if any of this resonates with you. So, okay, back to cholesterol. We tend to use inaccurate wording when we're talking about cholesterol. So we say good and bad when referring to HDL and LDL cholesterol. All cholesterol is the same. It's neither good nor bad. HDL and LDL are not actually types of cholesterol. They are the packaging that cholesterol travels in through your bloodstream. So HDL and LDL are lipoproteins, either high density lipoprotein, that's your HDL, or low density lipoprotein, LDL. And so those lipoproteins are like cars, and cholesterol is like the passenger that's traveling around in them. You probably already know that HDL is the good type of cholesterol carrier, and that LDL is the bad kind. But again, it's not that simple when it comes to LDL. So saturated fat has been shown to raise LDL particles. But what saturated fat also does is raise your HDL particles. And that fact has been largely ignored by your conventional dietary advice. Then we also have newer research that shows that there's different types of particles of LDL lipoprotein. So some are small and dense, and some are large and fluffy. The small, dense ones can easily penetrate the arterial walls. They can cause or worsen damage to the arterial walls, and they're easily oxidized or damaged. And so those do contribute to poor heart health. Then the large, fluffy LDL particles do not easily penetrate arterial walls. They are not easily oxidized, and so they're not easily prone to damage. So one way of improving your cholesterol profile is if you have higher levels of HDL, and then with your LDL, you want to have mostly the large, fluffy type. So guess what fat can help make that happen? Saturated. Yes, saturated fat can raise your LDL, but it can also raise your HDL, and the type of LDL that it causes an increase of is those large, fluffy, not easily oxidized LDL particles. I'm not saying that there's no problem with having really high LDL as long as they're fluffy and large. It's still, in large enough concentrations, it can still be harmful. So you want to not only look at the particle size, whether they're small and dense, large and fluffy, but also still be aware of that particle number of the LDL. Because if we look at the analogy again of LDL being cars, so not only do they carry cholesterol as passengers, but they also carry triglycerides. And triglycerides are how your body packages and stores excess fat. So those LDL particles are carrying around both the triglycerides and the cholesterol. The higher your number of triglycerides, the more LDL particles it's going to take to carry both them and the cholesterol. The lower your number of triglycerides, the less particles of LDL you'll need to carry the triglycerides and the cholesterol. So we want to bring triglycerides down so that we don't need as much of the LDL particles. So what are things that raise triglycerides? That would be sugar and refined carbohydrates are the two biggies. When you cut those out of your diet, triglycerides go down. And that's why higher fat, lower carb diets are shown to reduce your number of triglycerides, which is a good thing. Okay, so little recap. We want to have higher HDL, not too high LDL, but within that we want to have large fluffy particles, not small dense particles. And then we want to have low triglycerides. So again, what type of fat can be helpful in that? Saturated. Those industrial seed and vegetable oils, things like refined soy, canola, cottonseed, sunflower, safflower oil, and then refined carbohydrates, those all add to a poor LDL profile. So those add to the small, dense ones, not the big, fluffy ones. They also add to higher triglycerides, and they don't help your HDL. So vegetable oils may lower your LDL, but it's going to do so at the expense of the type of LDL and also your triglycerides and HDL. So that's not really what we want. Unfortunately, avoiding saturated fat has been one of the foundations of our diet for the past 60 years or so, despite any clear link between saturated fat and heart disease. There's plenty of studies that show the opposite, but it's gotten the most funding and therefore the most attention, but we're not really in any better health because of it. Okay, so a couple types of saturated fat. These are the fats that are found in animal products. So like your fatty cuts of meat are gonna have saturated fat. Cheese, butter, ghee, and then plant sources like coconut oil and palm oil are mostly saturated fats. And again, they're also, all of those are going to have monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids in them as well. They're not just saturated fats, but that is the type of fatty acid that makes up the most of them. Okay, so there's certainly other types of fats that are really beneficial. And like I said, I was going to talk more about them now, but I'll just do a separate video because this one's already getting a little long. So we don't want to eat saturated fat only and avoid some of these other ones, because there are two types of polyunsaturated fats that we have to get from our diet, and those are really important. So I'll go into those in the next video. But let me know what questions you have, and hopefully this was helpful. All right.